Greetings, future fossils. I'm going to keep this one short and sweet for episode 184, which is my birthday, January 1984, which is super appropriate for this bizarrely congruent confluence of minds that I get to share with you this time. This, I think, is the first episode I'm not going to bother to edit at all because it was just so delightful and ripping the entire time that I just can't bring myself to do it. So, I don't know, guess let me know if you notice a difference, if you take issue. I think I'm probably a whole lot less articulate when I don't pull all the fillers. But at any rate, Henry G. is amazing. Paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, senior editor of Nature, musician, parent, humorous person. I deeply enjoyed talking with the author of several books, including the one that we discuss in this episode, A Very Brief History of Life on Earth, which in, as he puts it, 12 pithy chapters, takes us all the way from the formation of the cosmos to the end of life on Earth, actually, into the future, in what I think is a rather virtuosic demonstration of speculative evolutionary biology in the final chapter. But it's possibly one of the best short, like 200 pages, ways to acquaint yourself in detail with how life has evolved on this planet. I really was deeply impressed as a lifelong fan of this subject, and you got to read it. That's all I got to say. But because he's such an interesting, multidimensional, well-rounded person, we spend a good deal of this conversation talking about other things as well, including the fact that he was the founding editor for Nature's Futures series, which was originally a commissioned science fiction series that basically hosted everyone of import alive as a science fiction writer at the time of its inception. And since, I mean, that may be an exaggeration, but, you know, it's not that much of an exaggeration. And we talk about music, and we talk about family life, and we talk about a number of other things. I really feel like this is a quintessential Future Fossils episode. I'm delighted that I get to share it with you. And before we dive in, I just want to thank every single person supporting this show on Patreon, because you guys, I'm up at 1 a.m. right now with my son in my lap because this little guy will not go to sleep, and I had to extract him from the arms of his exhausted mother so that she could get some sleep. And basically, this is the time that I have to work on the show these days. It's nuts. And without your support, I wouldn't be doing this at all. It would be too insanely difficult. And yet, it is precisely because I have this family that I must continue doing Future Fossils. So thank you to everyone. We're only about a quarter of the way towards my goal of 1,000 patrons. If you love this show, for the love of God, please put some money on it. $2, $5, $10 a month. I don't care what it is. The goal is 1,000 patrons. Special thanks to Jonathan Musser and Michelangelo for the latest sign-ups. Michelangelo, as you probably know, was the guest on 3 excellent episodes of this podcast that I highly recommend you dig back into the archives and discover for yourself if you haven't already. Oh, also, Patreon supporters just got their hands on the lossless downloads of my latest live performance opening for Devachka at Meow Wolf in Santa Fe, which was easily one of the coolest gigs of my entire life. That video is now up on YouTube and Bandcamp and Spotify and everywhere else. But if you're the kind of person who appreciates 24-bit Dolby mastered audio rather than 320 kilobytes per second MP3, well, that's just one of the many, many things that I do to try and shower my love on every single person who helps me keep this show on the roll. All right. Thanks, everybody. I love you. Enjoy.
So, my computer is very wayward. I bought it second-hand off a friend, and it's always been very slow. And I have connected to Riverside before. I have no idea why I couldn't do it today.
Not a problem. The way I kind of saw it as this, like tetrapods emerging onto land and then deciding, no, we're going back in the water. And then, like someone, I follow this science fiction newsletter that said that Star Trek Enterprise is the only show that got it right, because they're the ones that are showing.
Sorry, I missed you. Followed something, and then I had to.
I subscribed to the science fiction newsletter that said Enterprise is the only Star Trek series that got it right because they're the only ones that show the technology not working perfectly.
Yeah.
They're the ones that it's like, oh, I don't know if I want to go in the transporter. That's sketchy.
Yeah. So, it's, and after all the timing issues we've had and the reschedulings, I mean, it has to come right eventually. Oh, that's better. Can I hear you in both ears now? Say
probably.
Something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you better in one ear.
You can probably hear my daughter screaming in both of your ears too.
You see, I heard that before. You see, on my computer, I could see and hear you. And I just couldn't get my microphone to engage. It just refused to do it. Anyway, we're here now.
Wonderful. Well, I'm excited. I was actually up all night with your book.
Oh, no.
All night.
Oh, Christ. It's not that long.
It's been a long time since I pulled an all-nighter, but I really felt like I had, I've got a family and there's a lot going on, and I had, 20 pages left by the time the kids were asleep, and people kept.
Yeah,
anyway.
It gets better. It gets better, man. It gets better.
You know what?
How old are yours?
She's turning 3 this week, and he's almost 8 months.
Yeah, it gets better after they hit 5. Then it kind of calms down. I remember when our first child was born. He's now 24. The first 6 months was hell. And then one day he slept through the night. He went to sleep. And I remember me and my wife sitting exhausted on the sofa, and we just looked at each other and said, what did we used to do before we were parents? And we used to jointly edit this newsletter for local parents, and we used to put in funnies that appeared on the internet. And one was, so you want to be a parent, try these simple tests to see if you're fit to be a parent. 1, shopping. Go round the supermarket and do your usual shopping, but take with you a live goat. Being prepared to pay for everything the goat eats or destroys. Preparing your living room. Get a cooked fish finger, stuff it down the back of the sofa and leave it there for a year. This was a bit old school. Prepare your video cassette recorder, put a slice of toast into the slot. But my favourite one was how to dress a 1-year-old. For this exercise, you will need an octopus and a string bag. Now put the octopus in the string bag without any of the tentacles coming through the holes. And so you can relate to all these, no doubt.
Indeed, yes. I mean, I don't know. I must be a glutton for punishment because I have a great sense of humor. But it feels, I don't know, there was this thing, I don't know if I talked to you about this in the emails leading up to this, of which there were many. But,
there were, yes.
Yeah, but I kind of fell out of academia after I read a couple papers in the final semester of my undergraduate degree that kind of knocked me off the rails that I'd been on. 21 years consistent
monomaniacal obsession with vertebrate paleontology. And
Mm.
then I read this paper by Martin Nowak and Josh Plotkin on the evolution of syntactic communication.
Oh yeah.
And I realized, oh my God, they're talking about more than just syntax of words. They're talking about multicellularity. They're talking about social organisms. Like this is a math that the error catastrophe that they were describing here, and the recombinant adaptation to that crisis explains a kind of a teleology in evolution. And I got really excited, and I started pressuring. I was at the University of Kansas, and Ed Wiley was there, and of all people, the co-author of Evolution as Entropy. You think this guy would have some sympathy for someone with a yen for general evolutionary dynamics, but he was shockingly dismissive of the idea of evolutionary phenomena before DNA. My boss as a scientific illustrator at the museum, Linda Trube, she said, look, if you want to put an interdisciplinary fellowship together, you probably could, and you could probably get it funded, but you'd need 6 people advising you in 6 different departments, and they all hate each other, and they don't trust each other, and they don't speak each other's language. And I said, I'm the student. I'm not supposed to be teaching these people. And I bailed. And I spent 13 years in festivals. And the short of this story is that I feel like the insanity of making art and music and giving talks at festivals for 13 years before I fell back into the orb as a science communicator at the Santa Fe Institute had prepared me for children in a way, because it's like you're never getting enough sleep. There's always too much noise. You're just, so I'm permanently in a way kind of like peripheral.
I've got, during lockdown, I've got a new passion.
Oh,
so I bought a cheap guitar, and as soon as I'm a keyboard player, so I bought a cheap guitar. I've been doing some music with a guitarist friend of mine, but I need to play some guitar to show him what I mean. I play some not very good guitar so he can replace it with proper guitar. But lockdown does these things to you. I mean, I used to be a live player, and then lockdown, the pandemic, and I discovered I much preferred recording at home. And I'm afraid I bought this first guitar. It's a very cheap Epiphone IP90. There's a slab. But a friend of mine said, come on, you're soon going to get a whole collection of guitars. You won't be able to resist it. And I'm trying to charge this thing. And I said, no, I won't do that. But I do have my eyes on an Epiphone Les Paul with humbuckers in it. And I've just commissioned a woodwork friend of mine to make me a mandolin.
Nice.
So I'm, I got the bug.
Do you have recordings online that I
do.
can find?
I do.
Oh, good.
The thing you should look for is an album by the recording name is G&T, G and Thomas. It's known as G&T, and the album's called Ice and a Slice, and it's on Apple Music. My friend Adrian Thomas, who's an old friend of mine, I was in a band with him like 25 years ago, and he turned professional. He's a professional guitarist, and he teaches and plays. But then he had an unfortunate happening. He got psoriasis in his finger ends. So he can play guitar to teach and record a bit, but he's also a drummer. So he's back, behind the drum stool in about 4 or 5 different bands, and he makes a living. So during lockdown, he had plenty of time, but now he's always out gigging. So I don't know if I've got so much material. I've just sent him a disc to do another whole album, and maybe we will. But for this album, I used a Yamaha Clavinova piano, which I've since sold, and I've got my Krumar Mojo 61 organ, which does beautiful Rhodes and clavinet. But I had banks of synthesizers. I had an Oberheim OBX, and I had a Moog Model D, and I had, oh God, Korg MS-20 and a Prophet 5, but all on an iPad. And I had
Beautiful.
an Arpsalina string synth, and I had a Mellotron, all on iPad. So it sounds like Rick Wakeman and his and his 6 wives of the Knights of the Round Table going to the centre of the earth on ice, but it's just me and an iPad. But now I've got a Korg Nautilus, which is just fantastic. I mean, it's got so many sounds. That's the one I did for the audiobook, for the History of Life on Earth, because it's got the most amazing sounds. It's got the sounds of flies solving quadratic equations and aardvarks chatting to each other in Chinese. It's just the most. It's got super foley and incredible sounds, and it's got lovely world music. I didn't know what a duduk was. Do you know what a duduk is?
Yeah, it's the Middle Eastern string instrument with the little.
No,
No.
that's something else. A duduk is a wind instrument. It's like an
Oh.
oboe.
Oh yeah, that's the little.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
such a haunting sound. And they've got, you want a duduk, they have at least 3 in the Nautilus, and all sorts of other Bulgarian nose flutes. And I mean, it's just astonishing. So I did the audio book for the History of Life on Earth on the Nautilus. I mean, it cost me £2,000, but then but as I did the audiobook, it's tax deductible, right? So that's good. And most people really hate it. I did all these fantastic sounds, and you read the reviews on Amazon, and people say it's a fantastic book, but I really hate these sound effects. I mean,
Well, you've won
people,
my heart by doing the music beds for your own audiobook.
Yeah, I did the whole thing. I mean, what happened was, sorry, I'm blithering along.
Not a problem.
What happened was, I didn't expect them to ask me to do the audiobook. So I was very surprised when the publisher asked me, and I thought, basically they're doing it so they don't have to pay an actor union rates. I thought that's why they're doing it. But no, they did pay me. So then they said, hey, Henry, come down to London for 3 days and record it. I said, no, there's a pandemic. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to do it at my home studio, Flabby Road. And they said, yeah. I said, look, I've been recording albums. The one I did, G&T, was the 3rd one I did in lockdown. I said, I've been recording stuff at home. Let me send you a demo. So I sent them a demo and with some effects, and they liked it. So I did the whole thing. And they didn't require me to do much in post-production except take some of the dinosaur heavy breathing away. Too much dinosaur heavy breathing. So apart from that, and some of the vocals, some of the narration was a bit hot, so on the levels, so I had to redo a few bits. But that's pretty much as I recorded it at home, and a few people thought it was lovely, but most people hated it.
Oh my God! Now.
So what have you been doing at festivals for all this time? What do you do?
Well, I mean, I was a painter. I mean, I parlayed my scientific illustration training, because what happened was the University of Kansas Natural History Museum said, we really hate to tell you this, but we can't actually pay you what you're worth. We're paying you like a third of what you're worth because of Bush era budget cuts. And so, I mean, that I kind of lingered while I was trying to find an appropriate institution. I never actually ended up sending my vertebrate paleo recommendation letters out to the schools that I was trying to apply for, because I had met a girl who is these kids' mother now. We were together for 14 years before we actually had kids. But those 14 years were insane. And so, yeah, there were a couple years there after my undergrad that I just lingered around at the museum and did illustration for the curator of herpetology. And they said to me after a while, they're like, I'm sorry, but we wish we could pay you what you're worth, and we can't. And so I said, well, I'm not finding a grad school, and I'm not finding a scientific illustration career. So I'm just going to bail. I'm going to go live in the one place that I know I love, which was Boulder, Colorado. So I moved from Lawrence to Boulder because I had fallen in love with Boulder at the age of.
Well, it's easy to fall in love with Boulder. I've been there once.
Yeah, I fell in love with Boulder at the age of 7 because that's where I met. That's where the second place I met Robert Bacher, and
Right.
R.T. Bacher I met at the age of 3 in Palm Springs at the Museum of the Desert. My dad was in town on a business
would do
trip.
it to you.
And
he took at an impressionable age.
Yeah, I mean he loves kids, right? And he took me under his wing. And at the age of 7, we were going through Boulder and to visit a childhood friend of my mother's, and my mom decided to just look him up in the phone book and give him a call. And he picked up the phone and said, "Why don't you come out to get tacos with me? I'm going to the field tomorrow. I just got over the flu." But let's do this. And he spent 2 hours with me at the Maya in Boulder. I don't think it exists anymore. The Terrace Maya. But he spent 2 hours with me just, doing this thing, drawn on little notebook papers, answering every question I had.
Oh, isn't that great?
Convincing my mother that she should let me have a pet snapping turtle, and then taking me out to his Datsun to show me the oldest brontosaurus bones then known to science in the bed of his truck. And, so that sealed the deal for me. And I fell in love with Boulder then for sure. And then I went and I did field work with him starting at age 12 every summer.
Wow.
Until I guess 19. I was there every summer in Wyoming and Como Bluff working on nail quarry and just
That's
driving
amazing.
past the original Stegosaurus quarry on our way out to the sites.
Now, Michael, are we doing this thing now, or are we going to start doing this thing?
I mean, we're in it.
Oh, we're in it. Okay, I just wondered.
I don't. I mean, at some point we are going to talk about your book, but I'm glad to get to know you.
I'm going a bit of an exclusive to you. This note, I haven't told anybody this. It's just our little secret. Okay. One of the problems that people have had with my book is there are no pictures, and so that's fine with me. I mean, I wrote it as a novel, kind of. I wrote it as a story. Didn't have to have pictures. You can imagine the things. I mean, but you're an illustrator, so I'm talking to you about this, and I'd appreciate your views. So I said to the publisher, I have 2 publishers, one in England and one in the States, and I said to both of them, hey, why don't we do a slightly longer history of life on Earth with pictures? And they said, well, let's see how this one sells first. So if you want to see one with pictures, get everyone to buy lots of copies. But I am doing a kind of children's version, this is the exclusive, which will be illustrated. And they already have an illustrator, but I've put your name forward and other people I know, just to see what they think. But it's going to be a children's version, but as it'll be fairly high level because most children know more about dinosaurs than their parents. So I probably shouldn't tell you because there's nothing been sealed, there's nothing been inked, there's no agreement, no contract yet been made, but I've been talking to the editor and we've been talking about what formats we'll do and so on. So there will be a version of my book with pictures aimed at, pre-teens, I suppose.
Well, I'll buy it for my kids without question.
Yeah,
and I'm honored that you put my name in the hat, in spite of the fact that I'm rusty as hell. I recently...
Well, I like your pictures. You sent me an email, in our many problems of trying to get in touch. You said, by the way, here's some pictures, and I thought they were great. And I put you forward with some other people, and I have to say, including both my kids, who are terrific illustrators, purely nepotistic. And I said to my younger daughter, "Hey, you can't do that." And my young daughter is very shy. She's 21, and automatically she suggested a college friend of hers who is now a professional illustrator, and she said, You can't suggest me. You're my dad. I said, look, you've got to, use the old boy network. That's the only way to get on. And although my daughter will go out of her way to go out of her way, my son is outrageously out there, and he also does amazing pictures as well. He is. He used to be a girl. He used to be a very strange girl, and then he transitioned to be a boy in about 18, and is now much happier. But all the time, he did the most amazing. He does the most R-rated cabaret at the LGBT clubs. You know, one of the best parties I went to was when he was in the cabaret of a gay club, and it was. I'm not a party person. I don't like parties, but I liked this party, and I realised I liked it because everyone was going as themselves, whether they were in street clothes or got up in the most amazing costumes. They were going as themselves and not as their daytime persona. So no one felt threatened, you know. And some chap pinched me on my bum. It's the only time I've ever pulled at a disco. I thought, no, he's not my type. Nice chap, not my type. But I thought I wouldn't be there. So, 1 o'clock in the morning. Much to my surprise, I'm still boogieing away on the dance floor because they had pretty old school disco, from my childhood. Donna Summer and all that stuff, and it wasn't, club beats, which is way beyond me. So, my son, he was then just non-binary. He said, "Has anybody seen my dad?" He was in the green room with all the other performers. "Has anybody seen my dad?" And they said, "Well, what's he look like?" He says, a bit 50s, fat, bearded. Oh, he's still on the dance floor. So I was on the dance floor. I was going quite slowly because it was 1 a.m, and by that time the floor had got rather sticky. Then this enormously tall drag queen, who must have been 6 foot tall without the heels, sort of floated towards me and said, "Oh, am I Henry G?" And I said, "Yes." And I said, "I don't really do all this, I'm not as young as I look." And he said, or she said, "No, we all have that problem, darling." And now this person called Glitterhawk is a great pal, with, I don't know he's probably called Kevin, and he works in marketing. I've no idea, but Anyway, sorry, I'm digressing into the strange world inhabited by. You've got all this to look forward to, mate.
Well, to tie this into the paleontology, then, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was always talking about how hyper collectivization leads to hyper individualization or hyper personalization. It's like, the niche construction, that happens at, when people like Jeffrey West talk about cities as, three-dimensional, complex overlapping transport networks. And so you've got, this super exponential bonus to the number of interactions that's happening. And that means to the number of niches that are propagating in that space. And so, a global, connected, highly heterogeneous society. And this is exactly what you would expect. And it's why I think, William Irwin Thompson, used to talk about how so-called evil is the enunciation of the next level of order. And he would talk about how people were freaking out about their kids listening to rock and roll or jazz, and how that, it's every generation has basically trained on data that no longer encompasses the world in which they live. And so this stuff comes up as noise.
No, well, it's just like the generals are always fighting the war that was won before last, aren't they? I mean, it's. But I have to say, I'm still lucky. My kids still love me, and this is because I've given them nothing to react against. I'm just even more outrageous than they are. It's the only way to do it. But this is something that you will find quite soon, is the love of dinosaurs that they will never grow out of. But I remember when Nature published the first feathered dinosaurs. I'm going to tell you the story, and then I'm going to tell you where the kids come in. I was at the meeting of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology in New York in 95 or 96. I can never remember which it was. Anyway, one of the mixers was in the Hall of the Northwest Pacific, the one with the totem poles and the potlatches and the Tlingit artifacts. And anyway, there we were, surrounded by totem poles, drinking beer, and this Chinese fellow called Chen Peiji turns up with this very greasy, much-handled photographic print of what became Sinosauropteryx. And, he works in the Yixian formation, but he's a crustacean specialist. So, they're crustacean little branchiopods and things in there like teenagers have spots. I mean, it really is. There's loads of them, and he was using them to do the stratigraphy, but he kept coming across the feathered dinosaurs, and of course the place is full of them. So he brought this photograph along, and everyone was wowed. Mark Norell said, "I'm on the next flight to Beijing," and I was standing next to John H. Ostrom, who was very old. And he just was completely lost for words, and he just sat down on a bench with his stick, and he was just amazed because all his dreams had come true.
Well, we need to give people some context there because Ostrom found Deinonychus, and so that was while and also, Bakker was a student of his.
He was the mentor of Bakker, and the two of them, they revived dinosaurs into these. Into active, fast metabolizing, intelligent creatures.
They gave them feathers before they had any evidence of feathers, and so that's vindication.
Right, but they made them hot-blooded. Because when I was a little kid, dinosaurs were seen as lumbering, stupid things that just died out because they were stupid. That's how it was seen.
Oh, I lost you. There we go. I hear you now.
No, somebody phoned me up. I cut them off. Chen Peiji was at this meeting, and it's at times like this as a journalist when you realise you've run out of business cards. Terrible. So I found a bit of cardboard, being very full of initiative. I found a bit of cardboard just the edge of a beer mat, and wrote my name and contact details. And through the crush of people, I gave it to Chen Peiji. And the rest is history. He sent Nature the paper, we published the paper, and many years later, I happened to be in China, and I was at the institute in Nanjing, and that was when I actually saw Sinosauropteryx for the first time. The director took me up to their strong room to see their treasures, and there was Sinosauropteryx and some other mammals and things. And then we came down and were standing outside this. Outside the building, and I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's very hilly, Nanjing. And we looked down at the bottom of the hill, and we could just see this old man toiling up this hill. And he got to the top, and it was Chen Peiji. He'd aged a lot in the previous year. I didn't recognize him, but the introductions were said, and then he got out his pocketbook. And in his pocketbook was this piece of cardboard with my name and numbers on it that I'd given him. He'd had it in his pocketbook ever since as a kind of totem. That really got to me. Anyway, to cut back a bit further, because, I'm being an editor at Nature, I get all the papers, but I don't see the fossils. And I always love to go and see the fossils if I possibly can. So when the kids were 4 and 2.5, the Natural History Museum in London, and I was living in London at the time, had an exhibition called Feathered Dinosaurs from China. So I dropped the young one at the childminder, and me and the 4-year-old got on the tube to the Natural History Museum. And my wife was a journalist. She was at the BBC at the time, and it was half-term holiday, so off we went. And because it was the half-term holiday, the main dinosaur exhibition, which is free, which is absolutely rammed, but the Feathered Dinosaurs from China exhibition was in a side room, and you had to pay extra to get in, so there weren't many people in there. And there were just 9 fossils in there, all lit moodily in this exhibition hall. And I think I had published 8 of them by that time. One of them was Caudipteryx, and that wasn't on the wall. That was on a tabletop slab. I hadn't realised quite how it's quite a big. It's like a turkey. It's great big kind of gangly thing. And I'd completely forgotten about the kid who was whizzing around this exhibition like a stray asteroid. And so I was deep in thought, looking at Caudipteryx, looking at the jaws and the feathers, and wondering what this was. And this little face appeared on the opposite side of the tabletop and said, "Dad, did you punish this in nature?" And I thought, yeah, well, out of the mouths of babes. You know, I remember the paper. Yeah, they sent it in and we punished it. That's what we did. So, you know, you have this to look forward to. It's going to be fun, especially in Colorado.
I saw the Archaeopteryx once, one of the specimens. I'm trying to look it up on photos. It must have been 2015 in Tucson at the Gem Show. They had it touring, and I had a religious experience with it because this is strange. I mean, I'm gonna, I don't know, out myself as a weirdo, I guess, with you, but yeah,
we're all weirdos.
I had I was painting in 2010. I was painting at NASA Ames. I was the only person that was ever allowed to live paint at an event that they were hosting.
That's an amazing place.
Oh,
building
the hangar.
It has its own clouds. Building one. So big.
So I was painting at this place, and this woman comes up to me, and she says she'd like to commission me to do a painting in exchange for psychedelic bodywork. And I said, okay. So I met her at her house in the Mission a couple weeks later, and she gave me 2CB and laid me down on a table and worked my back for a few hours. And at some point in that experience, I had been thinking about and it's politically, it's impolitic to call it this now. I don't know what to call it. But at the time I was trying to come up, I was like, do I have a spirit animal? And I couldn't come up with, an animal with which I identified myself, and, an animal that felt like my familiar. And somehow in that body work, she must've been working some deep tissue or something. And I felt this extraordinary grief. And then I realized that the reason that I had never been able to find my familiar is because it was extinct, and it was the Archaeopteryx. And the Archaeopteryx, I saw in that moment that I saw it with these gorgeous iridescent feathers, like a grackle, black feathers with the blue and green and white flare.
Yeah.
And then, so that was 2010. And then it was, I think, was it 2012 or 13 that they actually did the Melanopore research on Archaeopteryx and confirmed that they actually proposed that was the precise feather coloration of that animal.
I'm just still thinking, can you have a spirit animal that's extinct? That's interesting.
But I mean,
I think my spirit animal is a slug. It moves very slowly and eats a lot, like salad. Yeah.
Well, there's a tie-in there, I guess, because my friend Bruce Damer, who works on Origins of Life research.
Yeah, that's right. You told me about him and I've his work, and so I've been reading up a little.
Yeah. He works with Dave Deemer at UCSC, but Bruce was working with NASA Ames on some of the early A Life and Origins of Life stuff.
Was he working with Lynn Rothschild?
I'm not sure.
Because she's at NASA Ames and goes out to Yellowstone and looks at all these extremophiles.
It would not surprise me if they know each other. But I mean, the slug.
Her husband is called Rocco Mancinelli, and he works on extraterrestrial life. He actually put bacterial samples on the long duration exposure facility, and had them exposed to space for ages, and brought them down. And most of them had died, and some were alive, although very sick.
Huh.
But they could, with a bit of love and care, they could just about be revived. So he was trying to wonder if panspermia could work.
Unlike the tardigrades, the Chinese accidentally crashed on. Was it the Chinese or the Israelis?
It was the Israelis. I think that that Marvel and DC Comics have missed a trick. There should be tardigrade man, somebody who was accidentally swallowed tardigrades in a pipette, and then I was trying to make a little story about this. I tried to do this as a way of going to sleep, and I was having a nap. So I imagine this girl who's a mild, spectacled Belinda Barker is a nuclear um, uh, power station technician, and the cadmium rods are not going into the pile, and so the thing is going to blow up. So she actually goes into the live radioactive core and fixes it, and comes out, and underneath the radioactive suit, she doesn't realise she's suddenly grown this kind of keratinous shell that has it fades away when she's out of the radioactive core. So then she becomes a kind of daredevil who goes into space and into radioactive waste and molten lead and everything. So Tardigrade Man is the next superhero. They should do that. I mean, there's so many animals that could be superheroes. I mean, about Sea Cucumber Man, who assails villains by squirting its guts out from its anus. No, perhaps that wouldn't work. Yeah,
NSFW is what they call that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, you should know that there's a brilliant animated series for, I guess, children and adults on Netflix called Kipo and the Age of the Wonder Beasts that features.
Ooh, I should tell my kids about this.
It's a post-apocalyptic show in which humans have retreated underground, and when Kipo, the protagonist, comes back above ground, she finds that the surface has been claimed by all of these mutated sentient descendants of the animals that we are familiar to us. The wolves are especially hilarious because they're all like obsessed with science. They're all Carl Sagan spoof, the wolves. But each group has its own sort of clan, and then there's this one entity in there that is a hive mind of tardigrades that manifests in these like plumes of water and is able to shapeshift and take form and like mind meld with people and so on.
Oh, a bit like the thing in the abyss.
Yeah, it is, but it's made of tardigrades. It's like tardigrade hive.
Tardigrades are just the best.
Yeah,
they're so underappreciated, and they're just so cute.
So really this is actually a point of entry into your book, if you can imagine us finally getting to it, because one of the things I wanted to talk with you about is how I found threads through the book, and one of those threads is dimensional, for lack of a better term, conquest, or niche construction. Or the adaptation niche construction thing, and this the way that you tell this story about how in the water, and then just the extraordinary hardship. I mean, everybody thinks about this like flappy lungfish or whatever coming out. But like that was actually very late in the game compared to all of the other prep work that had to be done before that. The mycelia were there already, and the insects and everything else had, vertebrates were late to the party, and then and you end the book. Well, I guess then you've got the air. And you talk about the birds, and we've touched on that, but I think it would be lovely to hear you riff a little bit on the evolution of flight. And then you towards the end of the book, you talk about, let's not discount space, right? Like, we're very close, it seems, almost like, if we can not destroy ourselves first, to learning to adapt in I love that you referenced Dougal Dixon's Afterman, and then he's got the Man After Man, which apparently I guess was largely plagiarized from Wayne Barlow, but
I don't know, it's a bit strange, Man After Man.
But Man After Man has those space adapted humans that are like radiation shielded and everything, and so I would just love to hear you to settle into your saddle here as an evolutionary storyteller, and riff on
Oh,
this
okay.
thing
Which one
about,
do you? Which do you want?
well, just
What do you want
yeah,
first?
just I don't know, just talk about life as a process of continuing
Oh,
to
okay. Yes.
achieve
Well, here
success
it
in
is.
new
Life.
hardships.
Somebody who you will know from Santa Fe is Stu Kaufman, and
Yep.
he has this idea that life is this. He defines life in a kind of thermodynamic way, but life is that system that is constantly expanding its own phase space. It's constantly making new niches for itself, which is not the case for physicochemical systems. And this is why he thinks that having a definition of life is kind of impossible, because it's always changing the game. This is what I found in when I was writing the book, that if life has a motto, it's whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So that life originated very, very early. I mean, almost as soon as the Earth formed, as soon as the Earth was remotely habitable, there was life. It was just, it started very, very quickly. And this suggests to me that very simple life must be ubiquitous in the universe. I mean, I think it's one of the things that planets just get infested with, like, small children get colds. And it's just that something complex life is another matter. But once life gets going, it starts responding to environmental challenge by increasing in complexity so that it can basically run more economically. And the first threat was the Great Oxidation Event, cast your mind back 2.5 billion years ago, when all these little organisms which had adapted for life without oxygen were suddenly confronted with oxygen. And if that weren't enough, an ice age that covered the planet in ice for 300 million years. So what life did then was perfect something they'd been playing with, which was the kind of bacterial community. Bacteria are very gregarious. Lots of different species tend to live in the same places in biofilms and stromatolites, and because one bacteria's waste is another bacteria's food. And they're always swapping genes, swapping chemicals, and they live in this kind of freewheeling goblin market of exchanging stuff. And the what what they started to do was take this to the next level. So various different bacteria, each of which was specialized in its own thing, would live inside a common membrane. And the bacteria that did their own thing just became good at doing their own thing and leaving all the other uh, tasks to their fellows. So the little cyanobacteria, which were good at photosynthesis, just did photosynthesis, and they contracted out all their other functions to mitochondria, which used to be regular proteobacteria, but they were very good at metabolism and oxidative phosphorylation and releasing energy from food, basically. And then the original protagonist of all this was the archaeon, the tiny little archaeon that had started out by sending little tendrils out to other bacteria that surrounded it. These little tendrils eventually became the endoplasmic reticulum of the eukaryotic cell. But the archaeon was the place where the chloroplasts and the mitochondria parked their DNA. And so the archaeon became the nucleus of the cell. And then you have this cell, and the thing about eukaryotes is eukaryotic cell, it's just like Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. You can have little cottagers all doing their weaving and marketing and selling from their little cottages, but they can only do so much as one family operations. But if you want to do it more, you get all of them working together in a factory, and each one works on the one stage of the process that it does best. And this means you can produce far more widgets or cloth works or whatever than you could just by the sum of the cottagers. So eukaryotes could do more with less and go further. And that was the response to the Great Oxidation Event. And then roll a few million years, billion years further, more tectonic brouhaha and fuss and bother, and more ice ages. Some of the eukaryotes start getting together quite aggressively to produce multicellular organisms. They started doing this fairly early on with very simple fungi and algae. Multicellularity has evolved at least 20 times independently. But it was when the animals came along where multicellularity really became complex about 600, 700 million years ago. So that was another response to global threat. And so what happens is life tends to respond by increasing in complexity when disaster looms. And of course, you talked about the tetrapods coming onto land. Well, whenever there is a vacant niche, life will invade it, no matter how hard it is. I mean, back in the Cambrian, the Precambrian, the land surface of the Earth was volcanic rock. There was no soil. There was a lot of wind and water and weathering, but it was a pretty rough place to live. So it took millions of years of lichens and small plants and breaking down the rock and adding their own organic matter to make the first soils. And it was only then that the little bugs came in and lived underneath the leaf litter. And the tetrapods were, and still are, a strange group of fish adapted for water of negative depth. I mean, fish live in all sorts of depths. You have fish that live in the deep sea, and you have fish that live in the open water, and fish that live in the shallow water, and fish that live in water of negative depth, which is the fresh air. So when they were, the earliest tetrapods came from river predators that lived in shallow water, and quite often were above the water. If they were above the water, their first task was to get back under the water as quickly as possible. But that's how tetrapods came about. And eventually by invading a niche that other fish hadn't invaded. And then you get into the air. Insects began to fly. And so if insects began to fly, there are going to be other creatures that are going to fly to chase the insects. And so, and the most successful were the dinosaurs, who became the first flying vertebrates. I mean, properly flying vertebrates, as opposed to, things that just fell out and parachuted.
So, in all of that, there's a thing that you talk about here, where you strike it as a kind of like a folding, like, I don't know, like the way that I think of like the Baker transformation, where you take it's a chaos theory thing where you take 2 points on a plane, you fold it over, and then you stretch it to the original distance, and you fold it over again, and every time you do that, your original error measurement is doubled, and so you get these bizarre nonlinear things coming out of that, and that is...
I'm losing you, Michael.
Oh,
there you are.
Yes. So there's something in that kind of reminds me of, I don't know if you ever read Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which is
a long time ago.
Oh God.
Long
yeah. Such a masterful work of natural history as mysticism, right? And it's why it won the Nobel Prize. And there's this scene in that where she's talking about imagining the glaciers rolling back and forth like shutters, just like up and down, taking a step back, zooming out into the deep time, and just seeing these successions that you're talking about flickering. And as these glaciation and volcanic periods are flickering across the surface of the Earth, then we're being sort of like alchemically processed into ever more refined forms. And I really felt that in your book. And so there's...
Gosh, yeah. I should go and reread that. I haven't read that since I was 23 and in hospital with a back injury.
Oh, God.
I'd lifted a keyboard. Back in those days, they were big beasts. and had burst a disc in my back, and I was in hospital. My father used to bring me a very strange assortment of books. I don't know how he chose them. He bought some really terrible science fiction, but there were two books he bought, which one was Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, and I must dig it up and reread it. I found it quite hard work at the time, but the other book he bought was Jorge Luis Borges, Labyrinths, which is the English translation of his Spanish fictions with a few other things. And that blew my mind. And he's still my most favourite author, is Borges. So that's what rock and roll does for you, you see. You get in hospital and people give you Borges to read.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I delighted in seeing you bring up Borges in this book. I haven't read any of his stuff. I'm only familiar with it secondhand, but then David Krakauer at SFI and Tim Taylor, his office manager, or director of his office, they gave me the collected works of Borges just like a couple of weeks ago, and I'm about to dig into it. But then you also mentioned Olaf Stapledon.
Fry your brain. Oh, Stapledon.
Star Maker.
Oh, wow. Yes,
Star Maker. Like fans of people who listen to this show know that I am an Olaf Stapledon lunatic.
Are you?
Yes.
Wow. Well, I thought of Star Maker because, I've read it several times, and while I was writing the last chapter of the book, I got it out again to read. And the reason I felt I had to include it, there were two reasons. One is the scale of time. In fact, you know that in the book which we're talking about, which is my book, A Very Short History of Life on Earth, it's all available in all good bookstores. Students, it'll do half your assignments for you, so buy two. Some of the things you notice, there are no illustrations, but there are time charts. And it was because of Star Maker that I did the time charts in the way that I did them. Like the very first timeline is Earth in the universe. Goes all the way to Milky Way merges with Andromeda Galaxy at the top. And then I have Cambrian explosion, and then now, and then a tiny bit further on, extinction of all life on Earth. So it was there. It was just like the timelines at the back of Star Maker to make you feel giddy with the scale of it. So that was the first reason. And the second reason was when I was talking about the mayfly evanescence of human life on Earth. That we're going to be here and then we're going to be gone, like Annie Dillard's flickering of glaciations. Stapledon wrote Star Maker. He was a veteran of the First World War. For those who don't know, Stapledon was a most unusual writer of speculative fiction. And he was a pacifist, but he did serve on the Western Front in the First World War as an ambulance driver. So he probably saw more death and carnage than even the soldiers did. So he was like most of these war veterans, these authors that came out of war, they were so traumatized by their experiences that they could only express it in terms of fantasy. Now, Stapledon did his kind of, his more political, philosophical fantasies like Star Maker and Last and First Men. But another veteran of the Western Front was Tolkien, and he was invalided out with pyrexia of unknown origin, which we now call trench fever. And he wrote this story called The Fall of Gondolin, which is about this elvish city that is besieged by fire-breathing metal beasts, which then became dragons. This is a guy who was one of the first to see the first tank battles. Imagine how traumatic that might have been. So Tolkien, and then other war. I didn't really think about this until I read Tom Shippey talk about this. Kurt Vonnegut and Slaughterhouse-Five, who witnessed the bombing of Dresden. So Mervyn Peake and Gormenghast, all these were battle-scarred, PTSD-suffering war veterans.
I got one for you.
So, yeah?
Walt Disney was an ambulance driver in World War One. He was
Really?
well, I don't know if he was a driver. He was in the ambulance corps, 1916. Fantasia. Think about it.
Yes. Yeah. And also Snow White. I think Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is the best movie ever made. Um, Released in the same year that The Hobbit was published, 1937, and also the same year that Star Maker was published. Weird, this kind of stuff. Anyway, so at the end of Star Maker, the protagonist wonders how ordinary human beings can cope with the kind of dreadful horror of war. And he says, we have two lights for guidance. One is our own little atom of human community, and the other is the cold light of the stars, which seem very, very, very antithetical. But I hope you don't mind, and you won't, because I'm going to do it anyway, even if you did mind. And I'm going to read the last bit of my book about Stapledon. And Stapledon concludes in Star Maker, strange that it seems more, not less, urgent to play some part in this struggle, this brief effort of animalcules striving to win for their race some increase of lucidity before the ultimate darkness. And so then I write at the very end, therefore do not despair, the earth abides and life is living yet. Oh, I enjoyed writing that sentence.
It was
as
lovely.
You can tell.
You know, and it's funny because I know that Stapledon was an influence on Lovecraft, and I feel like Lovecraft completely missed the point.
Really? They were different times?
Well, I mean, Lovecraft endorsed him. Lovecraft celebrated him. You know, but I think, you know, Lovecraft had issues that made him unwilling to accept, you know, the madness of.
Well, Lovecraft and Stapledon these days would be seen as fairly left wing. And we know that Lovecraft was very, very right wing in his views.
So I don't know if this is pseudoscience, but it does kind of beg that question about whether somebody's going to call me on this. But it reminds me of something I had read at some point about that conservatives have a more active disgust response. You know, they're just like they just don't want it as much. You know, there's like no.
Oh, that's interesting.
No thanks. I'll have to look that up.
Well, I love Lovecraft. Lovecraft his writing is so bad that it's brilliant. If you know what I mean. And Brian Aldiss wrote that Lovecraft succeeds as psychological case history, even if it fails as literature. And one of the things you can do with very bad literature is parody it really easily. And lots of people, I mean, there are quite a few horror writers who started by parodying Lovecraft. You know, I think Clive Barker was one of them. I mean, but his Lovecraft mythos, Lovecraft worlds, Lovecraft use of language, just incredible. I mean, the man was a very strange, flawed genius. So, you know, Lovecraft is immense fun, but, you know, when you've read, you know, The Mountains of Madness or, you know, the horror over Innsmouth or all that stuff, when you've read it and you've stripped away all the terrible writing, it has a psychological trace in your head. It leaves some preternaturally chthonic ichor in your in your fevered brain, and it kind of sticks with you. Ugh.
Well, I mean, do you know? I mean, you must know Charles Stross.
Oh, yeah, I don't know him personally, but I know his work, and I know when his books about the laundry, where it's a kind of mashup of Lovecraft and James Bond. And,
right.
It's hilariously funny.
I mean, the two of you look like you could be cousins. I mean, it's
well, we do actually.
Yeah.
Well, and also I've got my Neil Stephenson beard.
Yes, that helps.
Yeah, you do.
But yeah, Stross is very, very good at satirizing Lovecraft as well. Yeah.
So I remember there's one of his books about the laundry where he has the protagonist's girlfriend plays this violin that's made of a human bone, and it's an genuine Erich Zann. and that's a short story of Lovecraft, the music of Erich Zann, where somebody has this haunted violin and plays this impossible music.
I didn't read that one, but I bought it for my wife because she's she was trained and worked for years as a concert violist and as a luthier. And so she stopped doing that when she had kids, but she delighted in that book, you know, because it's like she's very into spooky stuff. I also recently bought her Alan Moore riffed on Lovecraft and did a graphic novel called Providence.
You know, I kind of missed Alan Moore, and I should get into it because, you know, I've never got into the Sandman or anything like that because kind of graphic novels passed me by, and I've only kind of tangentially heard of them through reading Neil Gaiman and you know, books like Good Omens and American Gods and things like that.
Yeah, well, I mean,
I love Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman
Moore's
is just great.
Promethea, I think, is one of the finest graphic novels ever produced. But so actually, this isn't to the point of your book, but this does bring me to a question I wanted to ask you about, because we've been sitting here stewing in sci-fi references for a while, which is. Normally I don't read the press materials that publishers send me. I just want to read the book. I don't, you know, people send me like, you could ask them questions about this. And I'm like, no, screw you. I'm going to ask my own questions. But I, you know, like 2 days before our last week's originally scheduled call, I went ahead and I actually looked at that packet and realized that you're the guy that founded Nature Futures.
I did, yeah.
I was like, oh my God, like this has been I've only written ever one actual like legitimate work of science fiction. But I was like, oh my God, I need to write another because I need to submit something to Nature Futures. And so I would love to hear you talk about that particular act of transgression of getting speculative fiction into a scientific journal, because I mean, that was just like that was like a Hail Mary pass and you landed it somehow. And I'm amazed.
You see, the thing about Nature is certainly in the past, we felt that we could there was a certain, it's not quite so much now we're sort of huge and corporate, but when I started, Nature was a very small organization and we really had the sense of, hey, let's do the show right here. And we sometimes thought, we could just do stuff because we felt like it. And that's wonderful creative freedom. So it was 1999, and we were wondering how we were going to celebrate the millennium. And somebody in the office had the idea of commissioning a series of science fiction stories to celebrate the millennium. And I can't remember who it was. One of my colleagues insists that it was me, but I'm not sure. Anyway, this idea erupted to the surface like a kind of pustule, and the manager of the kind of books and art section said, "Okay, Henry, you know about science fiction, you run it." Well, I didn't know that much about science fiction, but so what I did was I wasn't quite sure what to do. But then it turned out that Tor Books, a science fiction imprint in New York, was part of the group of companies that also owned Nature. And one of the directors, Stefan von Holzbrink, he was a lovely, lovely guy. He really liked to get down and dirty with the kids, you know. And he came to my desk one day and said he was interested in features. He said, "Henry," he said, "you should visit Tor. They are one of our companies." So I thought, So I went to New York and I visited Tor, and I got in touch with can't remember the name, the anthologist. I'll find it. You know, Tom Doherty Associates. Oh, dreadful! I can't remember the name. A lovely guy who did a lot of their anthologies, who helped me, and he's dead now. And they gave me a whole pile of books and huge lists of contact lists, which I went home. So the first person I asked was Arthur C. Clarke, because I happened to have his email. The reason I had his email was I had done a film review of the Roland Emmerich film Independence Day, the first one, which I thought was terrible. And so I wrote in this, why don't people adapt the amazing canon of unadapted science fiction novels that there are out there? I mean, for example, I wrote Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End starts in much the same way as Independence Day, with alien spaceships hovering over the cities of the Earth, but what happens next is much more interesting. Well, it turned out that Clarke was our one subscriber in Sri Lanka, and he sent me a fax. You know, remember those? And the fax was a table of all his books, and when they were optioned by Paramount Pictures, none of them had been made into films, except for 2001, which started as a screenplay anyway. So that was interesting, and I got to talk to Clarke, and I got to meet Clarke. I actually met him. He was in London. And he wrote this story long before the column came out. It was going to be our first story, and he was. Oh, crikey! There was this is so many everything is a tangent. Everything else. There was an exhibition in London at an art gallery called the National Portrait Gallery, where they were going to have portraits of 100 famous people. And there was going to be an event in which the people themselves would also be present. So Arthur C. Clarke was one. He was quite old. He was wheeled around by one of his, people in his wheelchair. And I went up to him and said, "Hi, I'm Henry G." And his first thing he said was in a broad West Country accent, which he never lost. And I'm not going to try and impersonate. He said, "When are you going to publish my piece?" I said, "It'll be out soon." And he offered it for free. And his agent was furious about that and chased me up about that. So we started as we meant to go on. We had Arthur C. Clarke, and we had, Dan Simmons and Greg Bear. We did have Charlie Stross. In fact, the first bit we had Joe Haldeman, Peter F. Hamilton, Harry Harrison, Nancy Kress, Jeffrey Landis, Paul Macaulay, Vonda McIntyre, Cory Doctorow, Jack Cohen, an old friend of mine, Catherine Kramer, Jeff Crook, Stephen Baxter, Barrington Bailey. We eventually, in the end, had my favourite science fiction author is probably Ursula Le Guin. And I wrote to her and I got this lovely handwritten letter back that she said she wasn't going to do it. But eventually Vonda McIntyre, who was a great fan of the series, prompted her to do it, and they did one together. I also got Frederick Pohl to do one, who must have been about 1,000 years old, and he wrote it by hand, and I had to kind of transcribe it. Luckily, these stories weren't very long. Anyway, I ran that till about 2007, and then I gave it over to a colleague of mine, Colin Sullivan, who runs it to this day. What used to happen is it used to be at the back page of Nature, and it was only for short runs, and then we would stop it and do some boring marketing feature, and then people would write in and say, "Hey, what happened to Futures? That's the only reason we read Nature is for Futures." So no, I did it till 2012. In 2007 was going to be its third run, and the editor, Phil Campbell, at the time said, how long would it take you to bring back Futures? I've got nothing to put on the back page. I said, I'll just ring some of my mates, right? And I said, I'll do it on one condition. I said that it's not a short run. It's a continuous run. And, until, we run out of energy or the Earth is struck by an asteroid, whichever comes first. And good to his word, Futures is still going, although now I think it's just online now. And it's still there. I've made a lot of friends through Futures. Eventually, it was originally commissioned, but we opened it to all comers after a while, because people would write to me that I hadn't commissioned, and they said, "Will you accept my story?" I say, "No, we just commissioned them." He said, "Well, why didn't you commission me?" I said, "All right, then write me a story." So, eventually I just said, I mean, we get tons of them and we reject most of them because, most of them aren't very good. But we've discovered some really good authors, from Frederick Pohl, who must have been in his 90s. And we had a young author who was like 11 at the time. And it was immense fun. But, I moved on to other things. But, I still have half an eye on it occasionally. Sometimes I wish I was still editing it, but my wife gives me a Paddington Bear hard stare when I.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess Clark's gonna have Denis Villeneuve do Rendezvous with Rama now.
Oh well,
yeah.
I
so
mean,
we'll just put Villeneuve on everything. Like, okay, Frank Herbert, check. Arrival, that was brilliant. I mean, that guy, Philip Dick. We're gonna make a sequel to Blade Runner. That's, I don't know. Yeah. I thought it was better than Blade Runner in some respects, but I mean, anyway, that's it's beautiful.
So that's how Futures happened, and we did do a couple of anthologies. And once I was giving a talk in China and in Shanghai, and after the talk, these two very giggly young women came out and presented me with the two Futures books translated into Chinese. I had no idea. I've written some science fiction myself, but it was fun hobnobbing with the greats of science fiction and also finding some new voices as well. I got one from Kim Stanley Robinson, who was having an awful trouble writing, and he said to me, "I'm more used to 800 pages than 800 words." And Greg Bear wrote a very funny one. It was a book review by a robot called Alan 3, a book review by a robot of a detective story written by a robot called Alan 2, and the protagonist of the story was called Alan 3, and the story said a thinly disguised portrait of Alan 2. And there were some very funny tales that people wrote. I mean, 800, 900 words is just the right length for a good joke. So some of them were quite humorous. Some of them were very dark. And each one is a little, the Futures collection is a one of these kind of seasonal chocolate assortments of little tastes. I only learnt this later. It was called flash fiction. That's what it's called. Very brief stories. Somebody asked me to write a horror story in one sentence, and it goes something like this. I had a wonderful telephone conversation with the person on the other end of the phone, and it was only when I finished the conversation that the phone had been disconnected for months. So, a brief horror story.
I've had that conversation.
Yeah, I'm supposed to be writing another novel which starts like that, but I haven't really got it off the ground. I've been too busy doing other stuff.
Wow. So, I mean, I guess I hope it's obvious to anyone listening to this that you sort of embody the corpus callosum between science as, a practice of like discovering something that we know about the world that's out there, and science fiction as a way of entertaining possibility. And I've just always had it in my mind that these things are more intimately related than most people give them credit. And
well, they should be. Yeah. They should be. I mean, most scientists, are going to be sci-fi geeks. I mean, they grew up with Star Trek or Star Wars or Dune or, the things you were talking about, the anime. And the same with me. I mean, my father read me H.G. Wells when I was small. His father had read H.G. Wells to him. And then I got into sci-fi aged about 11, and it was all to do with it was all connected with my emerging hormones as a teenager. And I used to go to this strict boys' school in a town quite far away from where we lived. So after school, I would walk a few blocks to where my dad had his office, he was a lawyer, and he'd send me up to this attic room to do my homework. And then he'd finish for the day and off we go. Well, I shared this attic room with this young typist called Margaret, who must have been in her 20s. And she had this long brown hair and, goodness me, scent of a woman. I mean, along with my emerging hormones as a, preteen and sitting in this garret with this beautiful girl. And I learned later she was something of a tearaway. But she gave me all the science fiction books that she'd read in her lunch hour. They were Asimov's Foundation trilogy and all of Arthur C. Clarke and loads of other stuff. And they all smelled of perfume and cigarettes. So you can imagine the effect on me, aged 11 and 12. So my exposure to science fiction came at the time of the exposure to all sorts of other dangerous possibilities in the life of a young lad. And so that had much more of an effect on me than I thought. And so that's why I became a fan of science fiction. And I would imagine that a lot of people, I mean, you were exposed to science fiction at a young age.
I found Jurassic Park in its first printing on the end cap in a bookstore when I was living in Orlando while my father worked for Universal Studios.
Uh-huh.
Before I even knew that the film had been optioned and was under production by Spielberg, and that Crichton and Spielberg had made a backdoor deal, where they went through the whole hullabaloo of like shopping it around and letting people fight over it. And so, like, I guess Warner Brothers wanted to put Tim Burton on that film, and my God, what an alternate universe we would be.
That would have been fun.
Black and white striped T-Rex. But I found that book at 7 and I read it. I had read it 4 times, I think, by the age of 11. And I am tattooed with Jurassic Park.
Wow.
And,
yeah.
So I have an intimate early relationship with that. And then of course,
oh, wow.
Just being in high school, like my parents split up and I moved from Orlando to Kansas City, and I was, at first committed to not making any new friends because I had lost all of my friends, and I was like, screw this. I'm going to go to college in 4 years anyway.
How old
13.
were you? That's a hell of a time to move.
I was like, so I'm not going to make any friends. Of course, that's nonsense. But I was like, I'm not going to make any friends in high school. So I just spent my lunch hour eating as fast as possible and then reading Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, a bunch of actually some Clive Barker's more, that one he did on vampires on Mars. I forget what that was called.
I can't remember.
There was, I think I'd already read Ray Bradbury at that point. Sound of Thunder. I actually did as a forensics piece, as a dramatic interpretation in high school, and Blood Music, Greg Bear's Blood Music is one of my favorites to this day. That's how I spent my lunch period, was just hunched in a corner, doing my thing. And I think that's like, to your point, like to this intersection, I think, people don't give enough credit to the acknowledgement, or like they don't acknowledge that the hypothesis is a speculative fiction until it's not.
Exactly. It's exactly right. And I wrote a book called The Science of Middle Earth, where the whole shtick of the book was exactly that, was that science is the process of creating an alternate universe in your head and wondering how things would work in it. And this may be, and also because scientists are big kids, right? We still haven't had that natural curiosity beaten out of us by the regimen of school. So the scientists are usually the awkward squad, the slightly Aspergic nerds who never quite fit in, who tend to see the world in an unusual way, and look at the whole thing from a different angle. And it's people like that who overturn paradigms and discover new ways of thinking, which is what we like to see in scientists. And science fiction writers. And also, the really good scientists are also very funny, and so are the good science fiction writers. I mean, have you ever met Ian Watson? Ian Watson, who back in the 70s wrote these quite serious science fiction novels, The Embedding, The Jonah Kit, Chekhov's Journey, The Martian Inca, Alien Embassy. Well, he kind of took me under his wing at various conferences and edited some of my short stories. But he is the funniest person. He could have been a stand-up. I mean, if you hang out with people like that, there's never going to be a dull moment. So I was privileged actually to meet some of the people, and also some of the people that you meet. These authors are, some of the people had bad reputations, but some of the people were really lovely people. One of the authors I really liked was Ian M. Banks, who he's more popular in Britain, I guess. He's a Scottish author who wrote really slick space opera. He revived space opera as a genre. And his books are really slick, ultra-violent, horrific. I loved them. And I'd been trying to get him to write for Futures for ages and ages, and I never succeeded. He was the one person I wanted. But I was actually at a science fiction convention, and I happened to be standing next to him in the coffee queue. So I got talking to him, and, this is the author of this really tough, ultra-violent stuff. He was the kindest, sweetest, most modest, self-effacing person you could ever meet. And it was such a shame he's one of these people who was taken away from us far too early by cancer. But at least I got to meet him. One of my heroes. That was nice. And, you've always got to be careful when you meet your heroes. They might have feet of clay, but, you met Bob Backer at a young age, and I met Ian Banks, and I met Arthur C. Clarke, and they were all, Ian Watson, and all these sci-fi greats, and they were all just as great as I imagined, and very kind and helpful, and full of, very humble, and quite unaware of their effect that they'd had on so many lives.
I mean, you kind of have to. I mean, I remember just recently reading a letter, an open letter that Neil Stephenson published on his site about why he's probably not going to answer your emails. And he was saying basically that, it's just like the problem is it doesn't scale. Right. Like, you read someone's book and you feel like you've established a personal relationship with them because in a way you've entered their mind, and you've become an endosymbiote of their imagination.
Yeah, you have.
And
I mean, books don't exist. Books don't exist unless they enter people's minds. Sorry, I interrupted.
But yeah, so he's just like, so there's just no way that I can respond to all of this, or I won't write more books, and I need to write more books to stay sane. And that was I think that's, you brought up stand up, and it's actually funny because I've been, there are a few people, postdocs at SFI that go out and do a local comedy open mic here that's run by the guy that does our webmaster stuff, Nick Pelton of Wayward Comedy here in Santa Fe. And I've been meaning to get out there because I've written some stuff that I wasn't intended to be funny exactly, but I've read it aloud and had people in stitches, like psychedelic futurism essays that worked as comedy. And I was like, I should take this more seriously. But yeah, there's something about the again, the transgression, the way that it allows, you were talking earlier about, like people at these LGBTQ parties and, or just like, festival culture where people show up as themselves. I just saw a spectacular stand-up by Taylor Tomlinson, who, she was talking about how she's on medication for bipolar and her mom died of cancer when she was a kid. And she just leads, she walks people by the hand into the most horrific shit you can imagine with a smile and the confidence that this is the place for it, that this is what's acceptable. And there's something about the comedian as my friend Mitch Mignano here in Santa Fe actually did some graduate work on the trickster archetype and its manifestations in modern culture. And he talks about the importance of this, the importance of giving people a space within which they can entertain things as they are. And I think that's, that is,
well, that was always the function of the court jester.
yeah.
The court jester was the one person who was allowed to criticize the king without having their head chopped off. And that was an important function because they didn't appear as themselves, they appeared as the persona of the court jester. And that gave them the license to say things to the king that he should hear, but no one else would dare tell him. And so that's a kind of trickster. When you said trickster, I mean, I remember going with my daughter to see the Joker with Joaquin Phoenix. Did you see that?
I still haven't. Yeah. But
you should. Astonishing film. I mean, it's really, gritty. It's really, it's basically explores the whole Batman mythos from the Joker's point of view, and it's very revealing. And Joaquin Phoenix was just astonishing, as kind of that very damaged person who's trying to get people to see the way they are. And he recast Bruce Wayne as very much part of the establishment, which of course he was. He grew up in a big house, and he had Alfred the butler, and who's lots of money, very privileged, where the Joker was originally in this film trying to make his living as a kind of clown and children's entertainer. Sorry, I've
well, no, I mean,
I digressed again.
But I mean, it's great. No, I mean, we are doing what your book portrays the process of evolution doing, which is running every way down the mountain, right? It's maximum entropy production. We're in a way, even though we're not spending a ton of time on the content of your book, I feel like we are performing its thesis, which is that this non-linearity. But I just wanted to sort of make sure that I get this out there, that there's this thing about I feel like between the stand-up comedian and the science fiction writer and the scientist, well, I mean, there are different kinds of scientists, obviously, but I think the ones that I love are the ones that tend to be like the Kuhnian shifters. They're the ones that are attuned to the anomalous, that they're disquieted. They're not, they're in that sort of Joaquin Phoenix Joker way. They're not comfortable with the story that everyone is being told. And,
well, that's a very Philip K. Dick kind of thing, isn't it?
Yeah. So I don't know if you know Simon DeDeo. I interviewed him for the SFI's Complexity podcast. He's a Carnegie Mellon professor, very interesting guy. And he co-authored some work a few years back on he broke down using a Bayesian formalism, the way that people different types of explanations actually adhere to different heuristics for what constitutes a satisfying explanation. Like you can have a conciliant explanation, you can have a parsimonious explanation. And what he was basically saying was that, some people want one story that will explain as many different disparate phenomena as possible. Other people are looking for just the shortest line of code that will write, and so he was saying that basically the difference between the insane conspiracy theorist and a paradigm shifting physicist is, I mean, he's like saying like Maxwell, like electromagnetism is basically conspiracy theory. What differentiates, a major scientific breakthrough from a conspiracy theory is that these people are embedded in a community in which people have different standards for what they consider a satisfying explanation. And so they're held in check by each other.
I get you.
Whereas the conspiracy theorists are just surrounding themselves with with people that, that have the same sort of aesthetic for explanation that they do. And so, I mean, there's, it's not a personality thing. He was basically saying that, the difference that in some respect that insanity is actually like a social emergent phenomenon. It's not something that, this person in a different context may actually, be the one that is the on the parapet, the sentry that's seeing something before everyone else.
Have you seen The Bridge? Have you watched The Bridge?
No.
The Bridge, I don't know if it's available in America. The Bridge is a Scandinavian detective series. It was got to its fourth series. I don't know if it's anymore. And there's this bridge that goes across the strait between between Copenhagen in Denmark and Malmö in Sweden, and it's a series of each series is 10 episodes, and it's a crime story, and it involves a Danish policeman and a Swedish policeman, and the Swedish policeman is always this woman called Saga Norén, and she's unbelievably Aspergic. It's never said in the series, and has awful problems getting on with people, but she's kind of retained as a detective because she is so good. She strips away all the social convention and gets right down to the facts, and that's why she's a good detective. And also, it's because of that she filters all the extraneous noise out and sees things in a new way. Everyone is pursuing one line of inquiry, and she sort of says, but nobody's thought of such and such, and then goes and solves it. But she does it at immense personal and social cost. I mean, she's a very damaged individual.
That sounds like the way the BBC recast Sherlock for Cumberbatch.
She is a high-functioning sociopath, essentially. Sherlock. Did you like that? I did.
I loved it. Yeah, I thought it was brilliant. Yeah. Well, I mean, we're going on here. I want to make sure that we land this in your book. And I think, because
I'm trying very hard to, despite my best efforts to steer you away into all kinds of strange realms.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't mind at all, but I want to make sure
you're complicit. You're complicit in this, I'm going to say it's your fault.
Sure. Yeah. But I want to run an idea past you and then use it as a bridge to get into sort of the last chapter of your book. Because, you're talking earlier about the early bacterial soup and these cohorts of, heterogeneous bacterial affiliation. And you called it a freewheeling goblin market. And I've been thinking about, what's going on right now on the internet and the way that arguably, and I think that some of the folks at SFI could formalize this in mathematical hieroglyphics I can't read. But they would say that, actually David Krakauer has said this, that modernity is defined by it's the moment at which culture started learning faster due to the recombinant collective learning than any individual. And so you have people like, Alexander von Humboldt, who is sort of like, in some respects, the last true polymath, the last person who could stand on the top of the, Chimborazo and see it all. And, one guy, and see the isotherms and get it. And then as he went on in his life, he started having to enlist people in that process. I spoke to Andrea Wolf, his biographer, about this on the other podcast. But so like there's, now we live in an era where, in a way, the horizontal transfer of cultural information between people is arguably more prominent and more of a causal force in our lives and in the shape and the texture and the future of civilization than our genetic inheritance. And, when people talk about, as a musician, people talk about the death of the genre, because we're now in this thing where it looks like musical genres are exchanging bacterial plasmids so rapidly, because in order to have a genre, you need to have a subculture. It needs to be anchored in a space. It needs to have a bubble around it that differentiates it from everything else, and it's impossible to have that in the age of Spotify. And so now we're sort of migrating into a new informational architecture in which it's algorithmic recommendation rather than you go to the record store and you look under alt rock or whatever. And so it's not, it's not that the genre has died. The genre has actually super exponentially proliferated, but it's no longer useful in the same way that it was. And it exists within this larger superstructure, the way that bacteria relate now to eukaryotes. And so anyway, that's just a convoluted way of getting into, some of the stuff that that honestly, I loved that by the end of this book, you're stating things about the future of life on Earth with the same authority and certitude that you were talking about the evolution of flight, or the evolution of the mammalian ear, which is such a virtuosic passage, and people need to read that. It was beautiful. Or the evolution of the jaw. These things that we're like fairly well understood at this point. And you go on and you talk about these new enfoldings of different organisms together into greater wholes, and the way that they will face the hardships of the future of the planet. And I found it completely plausible. I was absolutely willing to just let you put me in the little cart and put on the rail, and it's a small world and we're going to see it. And that was one of the points you were making, actually, was that things are going to get smaller again. So I would love to hear you kind of just unpack all of that for people as a parting gift.
Great. Well, as we were talking earlier about the increasing complexity, one thing I learned while writing the book was something from a book by Peter Ward and Donald Brownlee about how the Earth will evolve in the future. They were talking about the geophysics rather than the life on Earth. Amid all the comings and goings and the great parade of life, there are two things that are happening. One is the decrease in carbon dioxide. Now, this might seem very strange. We're living in rather too much, but carbon dioxide has its ups and downs on various scales, but on the longest scale, it's going down. And the other one is the increase in brightness of the sun. And so I decided to put that together with what I'd seen of the properties of life, which is to become more integrated, to become more complex. And then I remember a book I read recently by now the late E.O. Wilson called The Social Conquest of Earth, that said that the most important, the most successful living organisms are the social ones. And we've been talking about bacteria. These are social organisms, still the most successful. And then the social insects, massively important in terms of the biosphere, the cycling of nutrients, and in sheer numbers. And of course, human beings. We are a super organism. You and me, if we were cast away with nothing on a desert island, we could probably survive just about, but in no way with the comfort and sophistication that we can do now, because there are other people we rely on to make the technology that we can talk to each other and supply the electricity and grind the beans and make this whole civilizational edifice. Humans are a super organism. So I thought a superorganism or organisation has been happening for millions of years. The mycorrhizae associating with plants, the yucca and the yucca moth, the fig and the fig wasp. Things will become more, and in fact, if you look at inside our cells, there are little organisms. Inside our guts, there are at least as many bacteria in our guts as there are cells in our body that have all kinds of effects on our life, including our mental states. And these are part of us, these bacteria. So organisms, in order to survive, will become more and more and more integrated, so that the last organisms will be a kind of hardly imaginable integration of animals, plants, and fungi, and later on bacteria as it gets too hot to be on the surface, and the warmth will heat up the very slow, deep biosphere where bacteria take thousands of years to divide. And so, in the last days of the Earth, the last organisms will be immense conglomerations of what were once recognizable organisms, but are no more individual than mitochondria are in a cell. They hark back to their bacterial origin, but they couldn't live on their own now. Until I say in the very last phase of life, now this is getting even more speculative, maybe there will only be one organism. The whole of life will link together by mycelia to become one organism defiant against the death of the earth. Now, I'm glad you say I made it very plausible. This is the science fiction writer in me.
Stapledon.
Yeah, exactly so. Or H.G. Wells, the time traveller, goes to see the end of the earth. There's these crab-like organisms on this stagnant ocean with a huge bloated red sun. And some of these sci-fi authors make you feel as if you were there. So I felt that if I'm going to do a very short history of life on Earth, or even a long history of life on Earth, I can't just stop at the privileged position that is now, because there is nothing special about now in terms of the history of life on Earth. I wanted to think like one of Vonnegut's Tralfamadorians who live their life in all phases of life at once. They can see the future and the past, and they see it all at once. Or like Stapledon's The Creator, who can see the whole totality of the universe at once. So I wanted to do a complete history of life on Earth. Now, who's to say whether I'm right or wrong? I was starting with what I thought were fairly reasonable jumping off points, which is what hard SF authors do. Yes, there are superorganisms. Yes, carbon dioxide is decreasing. Yes, the sun is heating up. There is more and more land tectonic activity that will decrease in time, and that will stop the circulation of nutrients, and that will basically turn off the lights, and life will die. So I wanted to do it in a dramatic way. I'm not sure that it's ever been done before in a popular science book. I mean, I may be wrong. So many books, so little time. I hadn't really thought of doing it like that until I got to it. I don't think it was in the original plan, but I thought, how am I going to end this? If I'm going to do a history of life on Earth, I can't just stop. I mean, basically, it could have stopped at the end of prehistory, where human beings woke up into sentience. But I felt I ought to skate over the tiny ephemeral human.
The human exceptionalism can just.
Yeah. So humans come, humans will go, just like the dinosaurs or indeed any other species, and the effect will be minimal. But then what then will happen? Because we're just at the beginning of this huge ice age, which is going to go on for another 30 million years until Antarctica gets off its arse and moves off the pole. And there are going to be hundreds more glacial, interglacial cycles, and we're just living in one of them.
Well, okay, so can I maybe as a just as a last thing issue a bit of a challenge here, because as plausible as plausible as I said it was, I thought there was a strange absence in what you were talking about, and for me it was what Kevin Kelly calls the technium. He describes the sum total of technologies as the seventh kingdom of life. And, again, to reference the historian William Irwin Thompson, when he's talking about the entelechy and how we're moving into an era in which we understand our identity not only as animals, but as animals defined relationally with other animals, as well as the vegetal world and the mineral world, and the intelligences now that are being formally defined by people like David Krakauer and Chris Kempis at SFI in their paper Multiple Paths to Multiple Life, using information theory to describe things like constitutions and blockchains as living systems. And so, there's this sense in which, if the point, Bill was talking about, the Titans are replaced by the gods are replaced by people. And in every case, mythologically, it's something is replaced by something smaller and faster. And we currently are watching this happen with these machine intelligences and the complex systems of civilization that are outwitting us now, are that we're like the trees to them, but we're also integrated with them very deeply. And so I'm just this is where I'd like to play with you here, because I'm curious, because I do not in any way think of this as technology as separate from humans, but in Bill Thompson's way of thinking it, because he was in Lynn Margulis and Francisco Varela and Umberto Maturana, and Stu Kaufman were all part of the Lindisfarne Association, Bill's organization. And he thought of humans as the sort of mitochondria within this larger thing that transcended what we conventionally understand as biological. And I'm curious to your thoughts on that.
No, I'm not sure about this. Well, on the one side, what you've done is exemplified by a movie. Have you seen the movie She?
Yes.
No, Her.
Yes, her. Again, another Joaquin Phoenix film, yes.
Yeah, where a man falls in love with the operating system, and it turns out that she's in love with hundreds of people because she runs much faster than everyone else. And my wife refused to see it with me because she said it reminded me too much of me and my iPhone. We've got three people in this marriage, me, him, and his iPhone. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, who programs all these things? It's people who program all these things. We have AlphaGo that can play Go better than any human being, but that's all it can do. And maybe something will happen in the future to make these things more human-like. But a friend of mine was talking about, I was enthusing to a friend of mine about the wonders of internet commerce, and he brought me down to earth. He said, in the end, it all comes down to a man in a van. So there are always going to be people may be dependent on technology, but technology always depends on people. And we were talking earlier about, the Enterprise Star Trek was the best one because it portrayed technology as fallible. And the listeners won't realize the struggles that you and I have had just to connect with each other, just to battle with the technology, and that we've had to use our initiative to do it. I'm not sure that we're heading for this kind of singularity. Never say never that technology will come to dominate. I think, these things seem intelligent, but they're no more intelligent than a parrot or a telephone answering machine. They seem intelligent because they talk, and we as humans associate things that talk with intelligence.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I'm not. I'm with critics on the fact that, that what those expectations of artificial intelligence are constantly being punted down the road. We're not doing that. But at the same time, there are other voices with whom I agree that would argue that the singularity has already happened, and that we live within the, like Timothy Morton calls it, a hyper object. We live within the these structures that of the societies of the superorganisms that civilization includes all of this other non-human stuff that that exerts a downward causal pressure on us, that in a way we're like we have more of a relationship to society itself than we do to each other.
I think, well, I'm a very pragmatic kind of guy, and I realise that technology. Without this technology, you and I wouldn't be able to talk to each other, despite the problems we've had trying to connect. And just before the Ukraine war, I don't know when you're going to broadcast this, but the Ukraine war has been going on for just over 3 weeks. But just before, I did a live interview on Russian television. I was on a chat show. When you see a studio and you see the person on the big screen in the back, that was me from my office where I am now. And the Russian broadcasters got in touch with me on Instagram, and I had perfectly nice discussions in English with the young Russian TV producers who wanted me to talk about the extinction of human life. And they had people, panelists in the studio in Moscow or wherever it was. They had various professors and students and people come off the street, and they were talking, and I had a simultaneous translation in my ear. So because of all this technology, I was actually a guest on a television chat show in Russia. Now, not, and it was all through Instagram and Skype and whatever. And one thing I learned about this is Russians are just like you and me. They think the same way, they dress the same way, they know the same things. And, when you go to any other part of the world, people are very much the same. And this is something that we discover because of technology. Despite all it sounds very hippy, dippy, trippy, but despite all our upbringings, we're all very much the same. And this is why I think Putin's going to fail, because everyone knows everyone else. We all know, we all have, we all know Anastasia and Alexander in Moscow. They're our mates. We've shared memes with them, and we've sent them videos of our cats, and so that's what technology does. It's an enabler, but I don't think it's ever going to take over. I don't think there will be ever like transference of consciousness to an artificial substrate, for a number of reasons. One is I don't think consciousness actually exists. I'm with Daniel Dennett on this, but I think that if the human species is going, and this is what I do touch on in the book, if the human species is going to avoid extinction, it has to go into space and diversify into a number of different into colonies in space. But of course, by that time, we'll have ceased to be human. There'll be lots of different species, because okay, we might still have Facebook when we're all in space, but then we won't actually be able to meet each other and exchange genes, which is what it's all about. And one thing that is the blessing and also a curse of human beings is we're remarkably homogeneous genetically. The genetic distance between any two human beings is much less than the genetic distance between chimpanzees in adjacent groups in the forest in West Africa. And this is because of various bottlenecks that have happened in human evolution when humans have nearly become extinct several times. So anyway.
So more like a Dan Simmons future with the ousters.
Yeah, I like that. I like Dan Simmons, but he's very literary. I love the whole Ilium Olympos thing. That was.
I didn't get to that one.
Well, he wrote it in he wrote that conceit in a very short story in Futures, which was all about how fictional worlds are actually real. They're actually impressions of human consciousness on the space-time continuum that you could actually visit if the fiction was written well enough. And it was in a little story called Madame Bovary, C'est Moi. And somebody in the story interviews the inventor of this technique, who's now living as a character in Madame Bovary. But the thing is, none of the people who migrate to Madame Bovary or any of the 5 universes created by Shakespeare, for example, knows that they're in a story. We know who the main characters are in, say, Hamlet or Madame Bovary, but then he says, this raises the possibility that we are all living in a fictional universe, and if so, who are the main characters? He leaves it with that.
That's a fine place to leave it.
Yeah, I think so.
Henry, this has been such an incredible time.
Yeah, I'm now going to go and lie down in a darkened room, I think.
Yeah. I think I have to have a mass extinction of my bladder. So thank you so much.
You lightweight. You ought to come to England and drink pints, and then you'd know all about that.
Thank you so much for this. And I deeply hope that this is not the last conversation that you and I have. No, I have a list of things to send you. And I will get on.
Well, in the great golden future, when people actually meet to and breathe in each other's exhaled breath, like we all used to, maybe we'll raise a glass and have a good old chat, and keep on doing this.
And play some music.
Yeah, and do that too.
Sounds
right.
Good.
Okay. Live long and prosper. Take care.
Thanks again for listening. Follow me on Twitter or Instagram at Michael Garfield if you would like to steep more persistently and ambiently in the intellectual atmosphere of this program. Find the music for Future Fossils at michaelgarfield.bandcamp.com. And please help yourself to extensive public archives of book club recordings and additional content that never made it to the main RSS feed at patreon.com/michaelgarfield. We have some awesome episodes coming up. I'm excited to share with you. Thanks for holding tight, and until then, have a most excellent now.